Alright, Karina baby, today is the 21st, and I'm going to read you about the 21st. Oh, remember your first bike that you ever got? It was a balance bike. You've had other bikes before that too, but the red one was the one that you loved that I got for you. I know that you got a new bike since then and that you were super excited about it. So 21st is my new bike. I got a new bike for my birthday. You got a new bike for your birthday too. Look at that. The best one in the shop. It has gears to make it go faster and brakes so I can stop. There's a bell to ring on the handlebars so everyone clears the way. I'm racing off on my bicycle around the park today. That was for July the 21st, baby. You are 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days old today. Can you believe it? Mom, I can't believe it. I can't believe how big you're getting. But I can read you yet another princess story from the princess book. This book belongs to the library, so I really just want to get all these books actually read to you because I want to bring this back eventually. Yesterday was The Stolen Princess. It was a cute story. Mama needs to go check on the food. I'm downstairs today. Usually I read you books in my bedroom. But today everyone's out, so Mama's making dinner. And since I'm making dinner, I figured I would read you stories while I'm waiting for the potatoes. Mama's making pierogies. So I made the dough, and I made the innards. The potatoes are cooking, the beef is done. I'm going to put sour cream and sauerkraut in them, and some cheeses, and it's going to be so incredibly good. So, Princess Fior Urga. I need to go check on that. Hold on. Alright, sorry baby. Alright, so the Princess Fior Urga. A little way beyond the gallows green of cloak, and just outside the town, there is a great lull of water, where people in the winter go and skate for the skate of diversion. But the spot above the water is nothing of what is under it, for at the very bottom of the lull there are buildings and gardens for the most beautiful than any now to be seen. And how they came there was in this manner. Long before Saxon foot pressed Irish ground, pressed Irish ground, there was a great king called Corric, whose palace stood where the Lull now is, in a round green valley that was just a mile about. In the middle of the courtyard was a spring of fair water, so pure and so clear that it was the wonder of all the world. Much did the king rejoice at having so great a courtesy within his palace. But as people came in, the crowds far and near, they drew the precious water of the spring, and he scornfully afraid that the time it might become dry, and he caused a high wall to be built up around it, and would allow nobody to have the water, which was a very great loss to the poor people living around the palace. Whenever he wanted any for himself, he would send his daughter to go get it, not liking to trust his servants with the key of the well door, fearing that they may give some away. One night the king gave a great entertainment, and there were many great princes present, and the lords and the nobles without end, and there were wonderful doings throughout the palace. There were bonfires and blazed ranches up in the very sky, and dancing was there in such a sweet music that it ought to have woke up the dead of their graves. You see the princesses there? Of their graves, and feasting was there in the greatest of plenty for all who came, nor was any of it turned away from the palace gates. But you are welcome heartily, was the pauper's salute for all. Now it happened at the grand entertainment that one young prince above all the rest mighty commonly to behold, as the tall and as straight as ever-eyed, would wish to look on, right merrily did he dance that night with the old king's daughter, whirling there as the lights and as the feathers and as the footing into any of the administration of each one. The musicians played the better for seeing their dancing, and they danced as if their lives depended upon it. After all this dancing came the supper, and the young prince was seated at table by the side of his beautiful partner, who smiled upon him as often as he spoke to her. See, he was talking to the princess, and the princess smiled brightly, right? And that was no means so often as he wished, for he had constantly to turn to the company and thank them for the many compliments passed upon his fair partner and himself. In the midst of this banquet, one of the great lords said to the king, "Cork, may it please be your majesty, here is everything in abundance the heart can wish for, both to eat and drink, except for water." "Water," said the king, mightily pleased at some one calling for that of which prosperly there was a want. "Water shall you have, my lord, speedily, and that is such a delicious kind that I challenge all the world to equal it." "Daughter," he said, "go fetch some in the golden vessel, which I caused to be made for this purpose." The king's daughter, who was called Fior, which signifies in English spring water, did not much like to be told to perform so manual a service before so many people, and though she did not venture to refuse the commands of her family, yet hesitated to obey him, and looked down upon the ground. The king, who loved his daughter very much, seeing this, was sorry for what he had desired her to do, but having said the word, he was never known to recall it. He therefore thought of a way to make his daughter go speedily and fetch the water, and it was so purposing that the young prince, her partner, should go along with her. Accordingly, with a loud voice, he said, "Daughter, I would not, at your fearing to go alone so late at night, but I doubt not the young prince at your side will go with you." The prince was not displeased at hearing this, and taking the golden vessel in one hand, and with the other led the king's daughter out of the hall so gracefully that all present gazed after them with delight. When they came back to the spring of water in the courtyard of the palace, the fair Urga unlocked the door with the greatest care, and stooped down with the golden vessel to take some of the water out of the well. Found the vessel so heavy that she lost her balance and fell in. The young prince tied the vine to save her, for the water rose and rose so fast that the entire courtyard was speedily covered with it, and he hastened back almost in a state of desperation to the king. The door of the well being left open, the water, which had been so long confined, rejoiced at obtaining its liberty, rushing forth inconsistently, every moment rushing higher, and was in the hall of the entertainment sooner than the young prince himself, and so that when he attempted to speak to the king, he was up to his neck in water. At length the water rose such a height that it filled the entire length of the green valley in which the king's palace stood, and so the last pleasant loaf of croak was formed. Yet the king and his guests were not drowned, as yet now happens, if such an awful inundation were to take place, neither was his daughter the fair Urga. For returned to the banquet hall the very next night after this dreadful event, and every night since the same entertainment and dance goes on in the palace in the bottom of the loom, and will last until one has the luck to bringing up out of the golden vessel which was the cause of all this mischief. Nobody can doubt that it was a judgment upon the king for him shutting up the well in the courtyard from the poor people, and if there were any who do not credit my story, they may go and see the Lull of Croak, for there it is to be seen to this day. The road of Kingsate passes at one side of it, and which the waters are low and clear. The tops of the towers are steadily building, many be plenty viewed in the bottom by those who have good eyesight, without the help of spectacles. So anyone who has good eyesight could go and see this beautiful city that's underneath the water. And it's underneath the water because the king didn't want to share his water with everybody in town. He was afraid the well was going to dry up. Right? All right. The next one is the Princess Carpillon. The Princess Carpillon. So you're there with her moo cow. She's walking down the street. There was an old king who, to console himself for a long widowhood, married a beautiful princess, with whom he was very much so in love. By his first wife he had a son, who was crooked and who was squinted, and who very much so vexed at his father's marrying a second time. Being an only son, he said, makes me both loved and feared. But if the young queen shall have children, my father, who even disposed of the kingdom, will not consider that I am the eldest. He will disinherit me in their favor. He was ambitious, full of malicious and dissimulation, so much so that without showing his uneasiness, he was secretly to consult a fairy, who was considered the cleverest in the world. The moment he appeared, she guessed his name, his rank, and what he wanted. Prince Bossu, she said, thus was his name. You have come too late. The queen will soon have a son. I will not harm it, but should it die, or any accident happen to it, I promise you that I will prevent there being any others. Awake, and when he learned the sad news of his stepmother's injury of the loss of the prince, and saw that the cat in the swaddling clothes uttered such sad cries that they were as much occupied. Oh no. Mom, I skipped a page. I'm sorry. I'm like, why is this so far? Will not be any others, right? So the fairy's saying if the baby's harmed, she's not going to let there be any other babies. Thus promised, slightly consoled the humpback. He entered the fairy to remind her to resolve within himself to do some mischief to his little brother as soon as he was born. At the end of 9 months, the queen had a son, the handsomest in the world, and they remarked the extraordinary thing that he had the figure of an arrow imprinted upon his arm. The queen loved her child so much that she would nurse it herself. which annoyed Prince Basu exceedingly. For the care of a mother is greater than that of a nurse, and it is much more easy to deceive the one than the other. However, the humpback was so sullenly bent on gaining his end, and he vested so much affection for the queen and love for her and the little prince that the king was delighted. "I should never have thought," said he, "my son was so good-natured, and if he continues so, I shall leave him a portion of my kingdom." Thus promises were not sufficient for the humpback. He would have all or none. So one night he presented the queen with some sweetmeats that had opium in them. She went to sleep immediately. The prince, who had hidden himself behind the tapestry, softly took the little prince and put in his place a large cat, enveloped in a swaddling clothes, that the rocker might not perceive the theft. The cat swaddled, the rockers rocked. At last it made such a racket that they thought it was hungry. They woke the queen, who was still overpowered with sleep, and thinking she had held of her dear baby, They woke the queen, and still overpowered with sleep, and thinking she had hold of her dear baby, began to suckle it. But the savage cat bit her, and screamed out, and looked at it. What was her horror when she saw a cat's head instead of her son's? Her grief was so intense that she thought she should die upon the spot. That is so true, baby. When someone takes your baby away from you, that's the way you feel. Your grief is just so stricken into you. You can cry yourself to sleep. You just try to get through it. The queen's ladies disturbed the whole palace by their screams. The king put on his dressing gown and ran to the queen's apartment. The first thing he saw was the cat in the swaddling clothes of cloth of gold, worn usually by his infant son. Then he had thrown it to the ground, where it was squirreling wonderfully. The king was much alarmed and inquired what it meant. They told him that they knew nothing at all about it, but that the little prince was not to be seen, that they had sought for him in vain, and that the queen was much hurt. The king entered the queen's bedroom. He found her in sad affections, and not wishing to increase it by his own, he did violence of his feelings to console this poor princess. In the meantime, the humpback had given his little brother to one of his own people. "Carry him to the distant forest," said he to him, "and leave him quite naked in the most exposed situation, that the wild beast may devour him, and we may never hear any more of him. I would carry him there myself, so much do I fear you will not strictly execute my orders, but I must appear before the king. Go then, and be sure that if I should reign, I shall not be ungrateful." He put the poor child himself into the covered basket, and as he was accustomed to fondle him, the infant already knew him and smiled at him. Oh, as he was so accustomed to play with him, the infant already knew him and smiled at him. But the malicious humpback was less moved by it than a rock. He went intensely into the queen's chambers, half dressed from being in so much haste, he said. He rubbed his eyes as if scantly awake. And when he learned the sad news of his stepmother's injury, of the loss of the prince, and saw the cat in the swaddling clothes, he uttered such sad cries that they were so much occupied in consoling him as if he really had been greatly affected. The king and queen felt quite grateful to this wretch, and commissioned him to send to all the fairies and find out what had become of their child. Impatient to put an end to their researches, he brought them several different and very experimental answers that all tended to the same point, that the prince was not dead, that he had been taken away for a time for some inconceivable reason, that he would be restored to them, perfect in every respect, and that they would seek him no longer, as it would be only laborers in vain. He imagined that by such answers he should keep them quiet, and he was right in his conjuncture. The king and queen flattered themselves they would one day see their son again. In the meantime, they bit that the cat had given the queen proven so venomous that she died of it. And the king, overwhelmed with grief, shut himself up for a whole year in his palace. He expected still to have news of his son, and expected in vain. The man who took the child away walked all night without stopping. When morning began to dawn, he opened the basket, and the sweet infant smiled at him, and he used to do at the queen when she took him in her arms. "Oh, poor little prince," said he, "how unfortunate it is how unfortunate is thy destiny. Alas, thus art to be food, like some gentle lamb, to a famished lion. Why did the humpback choose me to help him to destroy thee?" He shut the basket, that he might no longer behold the pitiable an object. But the child, who had passed the night without nourishment, began to cry listlessly. The man who carried him gathered some figs and put them in his mouth. The sweetness of the fruit quieted him a little bit, and thus the man continued to carry him till the following night. When he came to a large and dark forest, he would not enter it at that hour, for fear of being devoured himself. But the next morning he resumed his journey, still carrying the basket. The forest was so large that whichever way he looked he could see no end to it. But in a spot thickly surrounded with trees he perceived a rock. Terminating in several rugged peaks. "Here, no doubt," said he, "is the retreat of the most savage beast. I must leave the infant here, since I am not in a situation to save it." He approached the rock. Immediately an eagle of the prodigious size reached out, flying round and round as though she had something in her nest. In fact, it was her young ones, whom she was feeding at the bottom of the sort of grotto. "Thus wilt be the prey of these birds, who are the king of others." "Poor child," said the man. With that, he unrathered it and let it down beside 3 eagles. Their nest was large and sheltered from the inclemency of the weather. He had much trouble in putting the prince there, because he said, if the rock by which it could be approached was so very rugged and overhung the frightful perception, he withdrew sight and saw the eagle returning swiftly to its nest. "Ah," he said, "there is an end of it. The child will soon be no more." He hurried away, that he might not hear its last cries. I can't believe he left the baby there. I can't believe he left the baby there. Oh my god. Oh my god. You never leave a baby. Oh my god. If you can help it, you never leave a baby. He returned to the humpback and assured him that he no longer had a brother. At the news, the barbarous prince embraced his faithful minister and gave him a diamond ring, assuring him that when he became king, he would make him captain of his army. The eagle, on returning to her nest, was perhaps surprised to find the new guest in it. Surprised or not, she exercised the rights of hospitality better than many people would have done. She nested close to her nursling, covered him with her wings, and warmed him. It seemed as if she had no longer any care but for him. A particular instinct induced her to seek fruits for him, to prick them, and to pour the juice into the rosy mouth of the little prince. In short, she fed him so well that his royal mother could not have nursed him better. As soon as the eaglets became stronger, the eagle took them out by turns, sometimes on her wings, sometimes in her talons, and thus accommodated them to look at the sun without shutting their eyelids. The eagles sometimes left their mother and flew a little around her, but the little prince could do nothing of the sort, and when she carried him into the air, he ran great risks of falling and killing himself. Fortune befriended him. It was she who had provided and so extraordinary a nurse for him. It was she who prevented him falling. 4 years passed in this manner. The eagle lost all of her young ones. They flew away when they were big enough. They never returned to see their mother or their nest. The prince, who had not strength to go far, remained upon the rock, for the prudent and anxious eagle, apprehensive of him falling down, and perceptive, carried him to the other side and lodged him in the narrow a cliff that the wild beasts could not get to him. Love whom thy paint as perfect was far less so than this young prince. The heart of the sun could not tarnish the lilies and the roses of his complexion. There was so much regularity in all his features that the finest painters could not imagine anything to equal them. His hair was already long enough to fall over his shoulders, and he was so lofty a mane that he had never been seen a child anything so noble and grand. The eagle loved him with an overwhelming affection, and she fed him with nothing but fruit, making this difference between him and her eagles, to whom she had only given raw flesh. She ruined all thy shepherds around in carrying away all their lambs without mercy. Nothing was talked of but the revenge of the eagle, at last trying or feeding her at the expense of the flocks. They resolved amongst themselves to discover her retreat. They separated in several parties, following her flight, roaming the mountains and the valleys for a long time without success. But one day they saw her all lit upon a great rock. The most courageous of the parties ventures to ascend it, although surrounded by 1,000 dangers. The bird had at this time 2 little eaglets that she carefully tended, but dear as they were to her, her affection was still stronger for the young prince, with whom she had been longer acquainted. As she was not in her nest when the shepherds discovered it, they had not much difficulty in pulling to the pieces of carrying off its contents. But what was their surprise at beholding the prince? There was something in the circumstances so wonderful that their limited reasons could not at all understand it. They carried away the child and the eaglets, all three screaming. Together the eagle heard them, and came swooping down upon the raveners of her property. They would have felt the effects of her fury if she had not been shot dead by an arrow which one of the shepherds let fly at her. The young prince, full of natural feelings, seeing her fall, uttered pitiful cries and wept bitterly. After this adventure, the shepherds returned to their village. A cruel ceremony was to take place the next morning, for the following reason. This country, for a long time past, has been the resort of ogres, and inhabitants, alarmed in such dangerous neighborhoods, had tried every means to get rid of them without success. These terrible ogres, increased by the hatred that was manifested towards them, redoubtedly their cruelties and devours without expectation, all fell into their hands. One day that the shepherd had assembled to deliberate on the steps and should be taken against the ogres, all at once in the midst of them appeared a man of tremendous size. Half of his body was like that of a stag, covered with a blue skin. He had the foot of a goat, and the club over his shoulders, and a buckler on his hand. He said to them, "Shepherds, I am the Blue Cantier. If you give me a child every 3 years, I promise to bring here 100 of my brothers, and make such a fierce war upon the ogres that we will drive them out, whenever may be the numbers." The shepherds hesitated to agree to do anything so cruel, but the most vulnerable among them said, "What then, my friends, is more adventurous to us that the ogres should each day eat our fathers, our children, and our wives? By sacrificing one, we should save many. Do not let us then refuse the offer of the Cantier has made." As upon this, they all considered to it. Oh, this is a long one. Oh, wow, this is a really long one, baby. I think... Oh, I'm glad I'm doing this one. I think we'll be almost done with this book after... Yeah. So this is how long this book is. Upon this they all considered it too. They pledged themselves by sacred oath to keep their word from their Cantier, and to their child should be ready for them. They departed and returned as he promised with his brothers, who were all the monstrous as himself. The ogres were as brave as they were cruel. They fought several battles, in which, however, the Cantiers were always victorious, and at last obliged them to fly. The Blue Cantier appeared to his claims his reward. Every one said nothing could be more just. But when they came to select the promised child, there was not a family who would make up their minds to give one of theirs. The mothers hid their infants almost in the bosom of the earth. The Cantier, who was not to be trifled with, after having waited twice 24 hours, told the shepherds that he expected that they give him as many children as he stayed days with them, and the delay cost them 6 little boys and 6 little girls. From that, the 4th, they regulated the serious affair, and every 3rd year they made a solemn ceremony to deliver a poor child to the Cantier. It was then the following morning, after the prince had been taken from the eagle nest, that this tribute was done. And although the child had been already chosen, it is easy to believe that the shepherds were willing to substantiate the prince, on contrary of his birth. For they were so simple that they sometimes believed the eagle's was his mother, and his wonderful beauty decided them absolutely to present him to the concierge, for he was so dainty he could not eat. Children that were not very pretty, the mother of the infant they had selected, relieved from the horror of the contemplating of the death of their child, found her despair and suddenly changed into joy. They desired her to adorn the young prince for the sacrifice, as she had previously her son. She carefully combed his long hair and made him a crown of little red and white hedge roses. She dressed him in a long robe so fine in white linen, with a garble of flowers. Thus adorned, he marched at his head the several children who were to accompany him. But how can I describe his lofty air, his nobleness that already sparkled in his eyes? He who had never seen anything but eagles, and who was still of a tender age, appeared neither frightened nor wild. It seemed to him that all those shepherds had assembled merely to please him. "Ah, what a pity," said they to each other. What is this child going to be devoured? Can we not save it?" Many wept, but it was impossible to avoid making the sacrifice. The concierge was in the habit of appearing upon the top of the rock, his club in his hand, his buskler in the other, and from this, in a dreadful voice, he cried out to the shepherds, "Leave me my prey and retire." The moment he saw the children they had brought him, he was greatly delighted, and shouted so loud that the mountains trembled. He exclaimed, "This is the best breakfast I've ever had in all my life. I shall want neither pepper nor salt to eat this little boy." The shepherd and the shepherdess looked at the poor child, saying to themselves, "The eagle has spared it, but here is the wretch that will end its days." The oldest shepherd took it in his arms and kissed it often. "Oh, my child, my dear child," he said, "I do not know thee, but yet I feel that I have seen too much of thee. Must I assist at thy funeral, who did fortune defend thee from the talons of the eaglest, and from the hooked bait of the eagle, since she abandons 3 today, and the victorious appetite of the horrible monster." While the shepherd was moistening the rosy cheeks of the prince, baby, I'll be back. It's going to be part 1 and part 2 again. I love you.